So I keep hearing about this global chip shortage. I'm actually having a really hard time believing that. I mean, what's next? A salsa shortage? Come on. Welcome to Machines and More. It seems like the best of times and also the worst of times. It's the most amazing time for hardware power and a terrible time for hardware availability. So it's either the greatest time to build a PC or it's the worst. I don't actually think it's a bad time, but you do have to be strategic right now. And something else I'm confident about is that a very effective PC build doesn't have to cost a lot to yield a lot of performance. And today I'll try to do a delicate dance around some of those component shortages to share a list of recommended components for your next value-oriented SFF or ITX build. Not everything discussed today is ITX or SFF specific, but these will all work together well in a build. And I will be leaving a list of product links down below, and please check that out. Also do me a favor and click subscribe and that bell for notifications, since if you're here, I hope you'll enjoy the future content that's coming up. So the price target for a sweet spot build would typically land around $1,000 US. But with the recent price fluctuations, I think anywhere from $1,100 to $1,200 now would be that target, depending on what GPU you end up picking. The target used for such a system is higher FPS 1080 or moderate FPS 1440p gaming for a user that wants to use a system based on stock clock speeds. So the parts I've picked are as much based on value as well as ease of setup for someone who's just getting into this. I'd also like to emphasize that with the graphics card market as it is lately, recommendations based on price get a little challenging, and certainly I hate recommending components that you can't just go out and buy at reasonable prices or, buy at all, but such is the state of the market for the last few months. When an entire category of a vital system component is unavailable or priced ridiculously, that's just super frustrating. Anyhow, I'll try my best to keep it real here. I didn't want to hold that back from the recommendations today, but I completely understand how difficult it is getting a card today. So I'll start with the case here, since that gives us a foundation to frame the discussion around. Now, if you've been following the channel recently, this recommendation will come as no surprise. We're going to be looking at the right here. The Cooler Master NR200 is a fantastic small form factor case at 18 or so liters, give or take. And while it's not exactly budget friendly in terms of PC cases in general, certainly for an SFF case, it can be actually considered quite affordable at the target price of $80 for the vented version. Now, this case is very beginner friendly, but it's also equally suited to the power builder. I've done simple builds in it. I've done some complex builds in it, and it kind of does it all. In fact, that's probably one of its greatest traits. It's beginner friendly since it's easy to take apart, and if you need to put in more powerful components, it absolutely chows down on them. And hey, it'll be a good home for anything you want to upgrade to in the future, within reason. The potential improvements that can happen in a future iteration of this case aren't likely to significantly shift its usability. And so as good as it is, I can totally see this being a case right now that a user can keep using for years to come. So with the NR200, you'll want an SFX power supply. You can get an ATX or SFXL to work, but I don't think those are the optimal setups if you're starting from scratch. For this build target, I'm going to recommend either the Gold Plus EVGA Supernova GM550 or the CORSAIR SF600 Gold, if you want a little more headroom for a bigger GPU later on. The V650 SFX from Cooler Master is also an option, but since the current fanless behavior can be a bit concerning for some users, and there is a revision in process with new inventory on the way, I'm going to hold off on recommending it until I'm able to test the new units. Now, out of these two, the GM550 is generally a bit more affordable, and it's quieter since it has a higher fanless threshold in my experience, but the stock cables are a bit ugly in my opinion since they're sleeved in a mesh material. I've got a GM450 in this build right here, and I use the 650 in my NK7-1, and I really like these units. This SF600 is a good unit too. The stock cables aren't that much better looking, but I think a little less noticeable. You will hear the fan on both units when the power load is closer to the specified max, but realistically, with the components recommended today, you won't get too close to that point. So now for the elephant in the room, the graphics card. This, for me, is that big question mark and the toughest recommendation, since the cards that I normally recommend are either priced beyond recognition or otherwise unavailable. But let's talk form factor first. Now with the NR200, you don't have to use tiny cards. In fact, you can use a big 3-slot card if you wanted in this case. But I think that the 2 to 2.5 slot thickness is where it's at for that case. That way you have good airflow and you can still mount some fans at the bottom. In an ideal world where you can get any GPU you want at the MSRP, I'd handily recommend the 3060 Ti Founders Edition card at the reference price of $400, but you know, that price is only applicable to the Founders Edition card from Nvidia, which has a very narrow retail channel availability at this point in time, and only Best Buy in the US has it, and many regions around the world don't even get the card. So, you know, I could recommend it, but then you're not gonna be able to get it, so if you can get it though, do it. Beyond that, pricing for the AIB or the partner cards on the 3060 Ti is getting beyond the confines of what I'd consider for this value bracket. And I am filming this, and the video will be released right before the 6700 XT launch. And if I'm AMD, I'm slotting that price point right between the $400 of the 3060 Ti and the 6800. So I'm guessing $475 or so. So that's also higher than what I'd consider budget oriented, but honestly, who knows if you can even get one, and ultimately how much retailers end up selling the card for. The 3060 on paper, it's okay, but that's AIB only, and the actual pricing gets pretty darn close to the 3060 Ti Founders card. Now, the Sapphire Pulse RX 5600 XT would also normally be my recommendation for the value realm, and it was in the high 200s, low 300s for the GPU market, completely exploded. So if you can't find those cards at a reasonable price, my advice for now is just skip the card and adopt a wait-and-see approach, at least for a few months. If you already have a card from an older generation, that's fine. Just stick to it and wait a bit and try your luck on the official retail channels. Which gets us to the CPU recommendation. If you don't have a graphics card and you want to start building, then you're going to want to go with something that gives you integrated graphics. Well, with that in mind, I'm going to recommend either the i5-10400 from Intel or the i5-10600K. Both of these saw a bit of a price cut lately, bringing the price to $170 and $230 respectively. The 10600K here will be a bit better for high refresh rate gaming because it has a higher turbo clock of 4.5 gigahertz, but that price difference may or may not be worth it for you. Plus, the 10400 is easier to cool. Normally, I'd say skip Intel at this stage in the competitive landscape, but if the price cuts are here to stay, and it's not just a temporary promotional pricing, it's a big nod in its direction, and you know, the 10600K is a gaming monster. Also, make sure if you're going for these that you don't get the F version of either of these CPU, because that's a version without an integrated graphics built in. At least this will allow you to get started, and while you won't be playing any serious games to start with, hey, at least you get a running system and you know that you can use to snipe that GPU with. If you can get a graphics card or you have an older one, that recommendation does change, because at that point I'd say take a look at the AMD Ryzen 5 3600. Now this is a fantastic CPU for the price. Typically, it comes in lower than even the 10600K's current low price, and comes with a usable cooler that you can get started out with. And for multi-threaded workloads, it typically edges out the 10600K. It'll yield a few FPS less than the 10600K, but functionally it's pretty similar. To run the 3600 at this stage, motherboard prices are a bit all over the place. Something like this ASUS B450 ITX that I'd normally recommend was in the low hundreds early last year, but now prices are hit or miss. And you know, as good as this board is, I wouldn't pay more than $130. It has everything that you would need to run the 3600, plus it has two M.2 slots. The GIGABYTE B550 ITX is my next recommendation. But what was a $170 or so motherboard recently is now a $200 board from when I just checked. And, you know, at that price, you could also go with the MSI B550 ITX. Also, you know, those are both good boards. If you're using a cooler that doesn't use the included AM4 backplate, then absolutely be careful with the MSI one. If the price is between this one and the MSI B550 at the same price, I'd still go with this GIGABYTE, since this is all passive board cooling. And these are the best VRMs for any B550 ITX board. For the MSI, you're getting that USB-C front header that you are essentially paying for but not being able to use with the NR200 build. And although RAM overclocking may be a little bit better with it, it's not a huge difference for, you know, the 3600 or similar CPUs at this level. For the Intel CPUs, the budget options aren't very helpful here, with the H470 and B460 chipsets all pretty limiting for RAM speeds, and with the Z490 ITX boards all being pretty high-end ones, there's pretty much just one budget option that I can recommend right now that'll still let you run a fast RAM kit, and that's this, the lower-end Asrock Z490 ITX board. It doesn't have the best VRMs, it's not that pretty, it's pretty basic, but you know, it'll work fine, absolutely fine with the 10400 and the 10600K at the stock turbo. And overclocking the 10600K is theoretically possible, but you'll really be taxing these VRMs, and plus I don't think it's worth the effort for components at this price level. You still get these two M.2 slots, and that's great. Alright, for RAM, if you don't need RGB, I'm going to recommend this Crucial Ballistics 3200 CL16 16GB RAM kit for either the Intel or AMD CPUs just mentioned. This is a good kit with a low height of 39mm, and I've seen this on sale quite frequently. The CORSAIR Vengeance LPX 16GB is also a very good choice. And this is also a C16 kit and plays very, very well in SFF because it has a very low height of 34mm. If you want RGB, the Team Group Delta 3200 C16 kit would be my choice. It's a little bit more spendy, but it does feature similar specs to the other two kits mentioned. I've seen this with both Samsung B-Die or Hynix C-Die, and both are fantastic. And this RGB integrates pretty well with most motherboard RGB solutions. With the 10400 or the 3600, you'll benefit from upgrading to a better CPU cooler from the stock one, and you'll absolutely have to get one for the 10600K. So I'll go ahead and recommend this guy here. You've seen this a lot on this channel, and this is the ID Cooling SE224XT. This, as I found out, is a fantastic cooler that won't break the bank, and in fact, it's one of the best coolers for single chiplet Ryzen. And yes, the price of this cooler is absolutely worth it. For over the stock coolers on the 10400 and 3600. Now it's between $30 and $40-ish depending on which color you pick, and it will fit with the NR200. But if you go with the tempered glass version, you might have to take off this top cover, which is quite easy. You just have to take off these Torx screws. For storage, I think that one single M.2 NVMe is a good choice. You could go with 500 gigabytes, which I think is the minimum to get started with, and then add another on later with any of these boards I mentioned, or just go ahead and bite the bullet right now and go for a single 1 terabyte NVMe drive. Now, either way, I'd recommend Western Digital's Blue Line for budget M.2 NVMe's. It's reasonably fast enough with read-write speeds around 2,000 or so megabytes per second from what I've tested. And one thing I'll note is that there is typically a SATA version that is priced similarly. There's not usually a compelling reason to get that, since it's not necessarily cheaper than the NVMe one, which is way faster. If you're running the ASUS B450 ITX board and running two M.2 drives, then running NVMe in both front and back M.2 slots will limit your GPU to X8 speed. So that may be one reason to go with a SATA one and an NVMe one, but even then, X8 isn't going to do a whole lot to a GPU at this tier. Generally speaking, it's a bit cheaper to go with one single 1 terabyte drive than two 500 gigabyte drives. So if your game library is pretty big, then I tend to go ahead and recommend that you start with the biggest drive that you can get right now. If you want a 2.5-inch SSD, it's a little more cabling, but not the end of the world. This WD Blue SSD is a good choice, but you know, at this moment I think prices are close enough between 2.5-inch SSDs and M.2s that the mini-itx builder should just start out with M.2 all the way. The final component we'll talk about is case fans, and while the NR200 comes with a halfway decent set of fans from Cooler Master, I think it would be great to start it on the right foot with a value pack, or fun pack as I call it, of Arctic P12 PWM fans. And you can get 5 for a little more than $40 right now, and what I do is just slap 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom, and you'd still have 1 left over to replace the kind of basic fan that's on the SE224XT. Or if you really want to up your game, run the stock sickle flow and a P12 at the top at a gentle RPM, then stick 2 P12s at the bottom, and then put both P12s on the cooler in a push-pull orientation and leave those suckers at 1000 to 1100 RPM, and you'll get enough cooling and you'll hardly hear those fans. With bottom fans though, my recommendation for this case is to run the cooler as a rear intake, but if you're strapped for cash, you can absolutely get away with running a fan or 2 at the top and just running the cooler as to exhaust out the rear. If you need a fan splitter, which I think you will if you're going with the fun pack, I'll leave a few options linked down below. The standard NR200 one is a 3-way splitter, so you'll typically want 1 or 2 more depending on how you want to connect up all your fans. Back to the motherboard. And that is my budget build component recommendation for early 2021. I hope this GPU situation gets a bit better and pricing smooths out. Hopefully we can revisit the GPU segment specifically later this year as pricing and availability changes. And hey, best of luck if you're looking for a card right now. I know it's been ridiculously frustrating. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And hey, thanks for taking the time to watch today. Happy building, and hope to see you again soon.